June 1944, Normandy, France. The greatest amphibious invasion in history has succeeded, but now the Allied advance has stopped cold, not because of German tanks, not because of massive artillery, but because of something nobody saw coming: hedgerows. You've probably heard the story of one sergeant who supposedly invented a device in 48 hours that saved D-Day, a lone genius with a welding torch who changed everything. It's a great story. It's inspiring. And like many war stories, it's only partially true. The real story is messier, more complicated, and actually more interesting. It involves multiple inventors, competing designs, bureaucratic hurdles, and a testing process that nearly got men killed. It's about how innovation really happens in war, not through sudden flashes of genius, but through collaboration, iteration, and a lot of trial and error. This is the true story of the hedgerow cutter, the device that broke the Normandy stalemate. And it starts with a problem that nearly lost the war. When Allied planners prepared for D-Day, they studied every aspect of Normandy's geography: beach gradients, tidal patterns, coastal defences. They knew the terrain intimately, or so they thought. What they didn't fully understand was the bocage, the ancient hedgerow country that covered much of inland Normandy. These weren't decorative garden hedges. Norman hedgerows were living fortifications that farmers had cultivated over 1,000 years. Picture this: earthen mounds, 4 to 6 feet high, topped with thick tangles of hawthorn, bramble, and ancient trees. The roots penetrated 10 feet deep or more, binding the earth into something nearly as hard as concrete. These hedgerows enclosed every field, creating a labyrinth of small, defensible compartments. Some historians estimate there were over 40,000 of these enclosed fields in the American sector alone. For the German defenders, this was a gift. Every hedgerow was a ready-made defensive position. Machine gunners could cover the narrow gaps between fields. Anti-tank teams could hide behind the earthen mounds, invisible until American armor came within killing range. The M4 Sherman tank was a good vehicle, reliable, easy to produce, and mechanically sound. But it had one critical weakness: thin belly armor. The bottom of a Sherman was armored with just 12 to 25 millimeters of steel compared to 51 millimeters on the front glacis plate. This wasn't normally a problem. Tank battles typically involved tanks shooting at each other from frontal or side angles, but the hedgerows changed everything. When a Sherman tried to climb over a hedgerow, physics took over. The nose would tilt up at a steep angle, exposing that vulnerable belly to anyone on the other side. German soldiers with Panzerfausts, handheld anti-tank weapons, learned to simply wait behind the hedgerows. As soon as they saw a Sherman's undercarriage appear over the hedge, they'd fire. The shaped charge would punch through that thin armor like paper. One hit to the belly usually meant catastrophic results. The explosion would tear through the crew compartment or ignite the ammunition storage. Sherman crews called their tanks Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter. Lights, first time, every time. It was dark humor, born from watching too many friends burn. The casualty rates in the hedgerow country were staggering. In the 2 weeks following D-Day, the Americans were losing tanks at an alarming rate. Some units reported 60 to 70% tank losses in sustained hedgerow fighting. Infantry casualties were equally horrific. Without armor support that could safely breach the hedgerows, infantry had to assault these natural fortresses head-on. The 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron was among the units struggling with this problem. This was a mechanized unit that combined light tanks, armored cars, and mounted infantry. Their job was reconnaissance, probing enemy positions, identifying weak points, gathering intelligence. But in the bocage, reconnaissance was nearly impossible. Every attempt to scout ahead meant exposing vehicles to ambush. The men of the 102nd watched their tanks burn. They watched crews bail out, some on fire. They saw the German tactics evolving, using the hedgerows as kill zones, setting up interlocking fields of fire, creating defensive positions that seemed impenetrable. Something had to change. The army wasn't ignoring the problem. Multiple solutions were being tested throughout June and early July 1944. Engineers tried using explosive charges to blow gaps through hedgerows. This worked, but it was slow, dangerous, and telegraphed your intentions to the enemy. By the time you'd blown a gap, the Germans had repositioned to cover it. Some units experimented with modified bulldozer blades mounted on tanks. These helped, but bulldozers were scarce, and the modifications were complex. Plus, pushing through a hedgerow with a blade often left the tank stuck halfway through, an even worse position than climbing over. Artillery could pulverize hedgerows, but this required massive amounts of ammunition and time. The German defenders would simply fall back to the next hedgerow and wait. There were other attempts: grappling hooks, cable systems, even ideas involving tank-mounted flamethrowers to burn through the vegetation. Some showed promise. None solved the fundamental problem. How do you breach a hedgerow quickly, reliably, and without exposing your vulnerable belly armor? Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen, Jr. was a 26-year-old cavalry reconnaissance man from Cranford, New Jersey. Before the war, he'd worked various jobs, nothing particularly technical or sophisticated. The popular accounts would later call him a mechanic, which was a stretch. He was mechanically inclined, sure, but he wasn't a trained engineer or specialized technician. What Cullen had was an observant mind and a willingness to think about problems differently. In mid-July 1944, Cullen was watching yet another failed attempt to breach a hedgerow when something occurred to him. The problem wasn't that hedgerows were impossible to get through. Farmers had been cutting paths through them for centuries. The problem was that tanks were trying to go over them instead of through them. What if you could attach something to the front of a tank that would let it plow through the base of the hedgerow, cutting through the roots while keeping the tank level? The belly armor would never be exposed. The frontal armor would always face forward, toward any enemy threat. It wasn't a fully formed idea yet, just a concept. But it was different enough from what everyone else was trying that it seemed worth exploring. Here's where the popular story gets the first detail wrong. Cullen's commanding officer wasn't a fictional Captain Morrison. It was Captain James Dupuy of New Jersey, the CO of Cullen's unit in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. Dupuy was the kind of officer every enlisted man hopes for: practical, willing to listen to ideas from any source, and not overly concerned with military hierarchy when it came to solving problems. When Cullen approached him with his idea, Dupuy didn't dismiss it out of hand. "Show me what you're thinking," Dupuy said. Cullen sketched out his concept. Steel prongs welded to the front of a tank, angled downward so they dig into the base of a hedgerow. The tank's weight and power would drive the prongs through the roots, essentially ploughing a path through the barrier. Dupuy saw potential, but he also saw practical problems. Who would build this? Where would they get the materials? Which tank would they use for testing? And perhaps most importantly, how would they convince higher headquarters that this crazy idea was worth trying? This is where Captain Stephen Lytton of Kentucky enters the story, and where the popular narrative completely omits a crucial figure. Lytton was an engineering officer, someone who actually understood metallurgy, welding specifications, and structural integrity. When Dupuy brought him Cullen's concept, Lytton immediately saw both the potential and the challenges. "The idea's sound," Lytton said, examining Cullen's sketches. "But the execution is everything. You need the right steel, strong enough not to snap, but not so brittle it shatters on impact. The welds have to be perfect. The angle and positioning are critical. Get any of this wrong, and you'll either stick the tank in the hedgerow or snap the prongs off on first impact." Lytton became the project's technical director. While the story often credits Kulin with building the first prototype himself with a welding torch, the reality was more collaborative. Lytton directed the engineering work. Cullen provided input based on his practical observations, and a team of skilled welders and mechanics did the actual fabrication. The third key figure was Chief Warrant Officer Frank Riley, also from New Jersey. Riley was a logistics wizard, someone who could scrounge materials and cut through red tape to get things done. When the team needed steel for the prongs, Riley knew exactly where to get it. The German beach obstacles scattered along the Normandy shore. These Czech hedgehogs, tripod-shaped steel beams designed to stop landing craft, were made of high-quality hardened steel, perfect for the job. The Germans thoughtfully provided us with our raw materials, Riley joked, as he organized crews to cut apart the hedgehogs and transport them inland. Riley also handled the bureaucratic side, requisitioning welding equipment, securing a tank for modification, arranging for a testing site away from the front lines. Innovation requires inspiration, but it also requires logistics, and Riley made sure the practical necessities were covered. Another detail the popular story gets wrong. The first hedgerow cutter wasn't mounted on a Sherman tank. It was installed on an M5 Stuart light tank. This actually made sense. The Stuart was smaller and lighter than a Sherman. If the design failed catastrophically, it was better to risk a less valuable vehicle. Plus, the Stuart's lower weight meant that if it got stuck in a hedgerow, it would be easier to recover. Captain Lytton supervised the welding personally, checking every joint, every angle. The steel prongs extended from the front of the Stuart at a carefully calculated angle, about 15 degrees downward. This would allow them to dig into the base of the hedgerow while keeping the tank's profile low. The welding took longer than the 48 hours of legend. It was nearly 4 days of careful work, including 2 complete redesigns when Lytton wasn't satisfied with the structural integrity. When it came time to test the device, the job fell to Sergeant Harmon McNaughton from Texas. McNaughton was an experienced tank driver, known for his nerve and his ability to handle vehicles in difficult terrain. "You sure about this, sir?" McNaughton asked Captain Dupuy as he prepared to climb into the Stuart. "No," Dupuy answered honestly, "but we need to find out if it works." "You're the best driver we have, Harmon. If anyone can make this work, it's you." The test hedgerow was in a field behind Allied lines, well away from any German positions. It was a substantial barrier, about 12 feet thick at the base, with roots that had been growing for centuries. Officers and enlisted men gathered to watch. Some took bets on whether the prongs would hold. Others bet on whether the tank would get stuck. A few optimists bet that it would actually work. McNaughton started the engine, backed up to give himself room for a running start, then accelerated toward the hedgerow. The impact was tremendous. The prongs bit into the earthen mound, and the tank shuddered, but kept moving. For a few seconds, it seemed like the Stuart might stall, embedded in the ancient roots. Then something gave way. The roots began to snap with sounds like rifle shots. Earth and vegetation exploded around the tank. And slowly, inexorably, the Stuart pushed through, emerging on the other side of the hedgerow with its prongs intact and its crew unharmed. The gathered soldiers erupted in cheers. "It works," Captain Lytton said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "The damn thing actually works." A successful test behind friendly lines was one thing. Combat was another entirely. Captain Dupuy arranged for a combat trial against an actual German position. The modified Stuart, still with McNaughton at the controls, was assigned to lead a reconnaissance in force against a German strongpoint that had been holding up the advance. The hedgerows surrounding the position had proved impassable. Every attempt to breach them had been met with devastating anti-tank fire. This time, when McNaughton approached the hedgerow, he did so with his main gun traversed forward, ready to engage any target that appeared. The prongs hit the hedgerow at full speed. The Stuart ploughed through in seconds, emerging with its gun already aimed at the German positions. The Germans, who had been expecting another predictable climb and expose manoeuvre, were caught completely off guard. The Stuart's gun fired, knocking out a German machine gun position. Infantry following behind the tank poured through the gap, and the German strongpoint fell within an hour. The combat trial had succeeded beyond anyone's hopes. News of the successful design reached First Army headquarters within days. General Omar Bradley, commanding First Army, immediately grasped the significance. "How many of these devices can we produce?" Bradley asked his staff. "That depends on materials and welding capacity, sir," came the response. Bradley made a decision that would prove crucial. First Army would manufacture approximately 400 of these devices and mount them on Shermans, M10 Hellcat tank destroyers, and M5 Stuarts throughout the army. This is where the 5,000 units of the popular story becomes clear fiction. The real number was around 400, still a massive undertaking, but logistically feasible within the constraints of a combat zone. With the decision made to mass-produce the devices, the real engineering challenge began. Captain Lytton found himself coordinating a manufacturing effort spread across multiple units and locations. The welding teams came from engineer battalions, maintenance companies, and even artillery units that had skilled metalworkers. Chief Warrant Officer Riley organized the supply chain, locating more German beach obstacles for steel, requisitioning welding equipment and acetylene, transporting heavy steel beams from the coast to inland workshops. Each installation had to meet Lytton's specifications. The prongs needed to be positioned exactly right. Too high, and the tank would still expose its belly. Too low, and they'd just scrape uselessly across the ground. The welds had to be perfect, capable of withstanding repeated high-impact collisions. Quality control was crucial. Lytton personally inspected dozens of installations, rejecting several that didn't meet standards. A bad weld doesn't just mean the device fails, he explained to frustrated welding crews. It means the prongs snap off at speed and possibly damage the tank or injure the crew. This has to be done right. As more tanks received the modification and went into combat, feedback from the field led to continuous improvements. Some crews reported that 4 prongs weren't quite enough for the thickest hedgerows. The design evolved to include 5 or even 6 prongs on heavier tanks. Others found that slightly serrated edges on the prongs helped them grip and tear through particularly stubborn root masses. There were failures too. Some early installations had prongs positioned too close together, which caused them to clog with packed earth and roots. The spacing was adjusted. A few units reported welds failing under stress. The welding specifications were revised to require more substantial joints. The hedgerow cutter wasn't a single invention that emerged perfect and complete. It was an evolving design that improved through the iterative process of field testing, failure analysis, and redesign. This is how real innovation works, not through sudden flashes of lone genius, but through collaboration and continuous improvement. The question of what to call this invention led to some creative naming. Different units had different names for it. Some called it the rhino, because of the way the prongs resembled horns. Others called it the hedgerow cutter, or hedge cutter. A few tankers referred to it as the Culin device, after the sergeant whose initial observation had sparked the development. Official Army documentation eventually settled on Culin prong device for the design that came from the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, though other variations existed. There was also a competing design called the Rhinoceros, developed independently by another unit around the same time. The multiple names and multiple designs reveal an important truth. The hedgerow problem was so pressing that several different groups were working on solutions simultaneously. Cullen, Dupuy, Lytton, and Riley developed one solution, a good one, but they weren't the only innovators working on the problem. By late July 1944, hundreds of American tanks had been equipped with hedgerow cutters. The impact on operations was immediate and dramatic. Tanks that had previously taken hours to advance through a single hedgerow-lined field could now breach multiple barriers in quick succession. Infantry could follow close behind armoured breakthroughs, reducing their exposure to enemy fire. The pace of the Allied advance accelerated significantly. Operation Cobra, the breakout offensive from Normandy, launched on July 25, 1944. The hedgerow cutters played a crucial role. American armour could now manoeuvre through bocage country with a freedom of movement that had been impossible just weeks earlier. The Germans, who had relied on the natural defensive strength of the hedgerows, found their carefully prepared positions could be bypassed or breached rapidly. Their defensive doctrine, which had worked so effectively in June and early July, became obsolete almost overnight. Captured German after-action reports from this period show confusion and concern. Enemy armour is now breaching hedgerows without exposing vulnerable areas, one report noted. Method of breach is unknown, but appears to involve frontal ramming at speed. The Germans tried various countermeasures, reinforcing hedgerows with mines, positioning anti-tank guns at different angles, creating false hedgerows as traps. None of these countermeasures consistently worked. The fundamental problem remained. The cutters allowed tanks to breach barriers while keeping their thick frontal armour facing the enemy. Some German commanders reported a psychological impact as well. Soldiers who had felt relatively safe behind hedgerow defences now felt exposed and vulnerable. The natural barriers they'd counted on were no longer barriers at all. As the Allied advance moved beyond Normandy into more varied terrain, tankers discovered that the hedgerow cutters had applications beyond their original purpose. In urban combat, the steel prongs proved useful for smashing through brick walls and wooden barricades. The psychological effect of a 30-ton tank crashing through a building wall was considerable. Many German defenders chose to surrender rather than face that kind of assault. During river crossings, crews found that the prongs provided additional traction when climbing muddy banks. In winter conditions, they functioned as improvised snowplows. During the Battle of the Bulge, crews used them to push aside fallen trees that the Germans had used to block roads. None of these applications were part of the original design intent, but they demonstrated the value of a simple, robust tool that could be adapted to multiple purposes. Throughout this period, Curtis Culin remained with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, though his role shifted somewhat. He was occasionally asked to advise on installation issues or design modifications, but he wasn't the central figure that the popular story makes him out to be. In September 1944, Culin stepped on a landmine. He survived, but the injury was serious enough that he was sent back to the United States for recovery and eventual discharge. His war was over. The hedgerow cutters he'd helped inspire continued to serve through the end of the European campaign, but Cullen wouldn't see their continued evolution and use. Captain Dupuy, Captain Lytton, and C.W. O'Reilly all continued serving through the end of the war. Their contributions to the hedgerow cutter development were recognized within military circles, though none of them received the public recognition that later accrued to Culin. This is often how military innovation works. A team effort gets simplified in later retellings into a story about a single inventor. It makes for better storytelling, but it obscures the collaborative reality of how breakthrough ideas actually get developed and implemented. After recovering from his injuries, Curtis Cullen returned to civilian life. He didn't go back to mechanical work. Instead, he became a liquor salesman in New York City, a career far removed from the tank warfare that had made him briefly famous. Culin was a modest man who didn't seek attention for his wartime contributions. When people asked about his service, he'd mention the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, but rarely discussed the hedgerow cutter in detail. He married, raised a family, and lived a quiet life. In 1963, at the age of 45, Curtis Cullen died. He was buried in Fairview Cemetery in Westfield, New Jersey. His obituary in the local newspaper made only passing reference to his military service. There was no mention of how his observation had contributed to a device that helped break the Normandy stalemate. No mention of the lives saved or the tactical advantage gained. He was simply another veteran, one of millions who had served and then returned to ordinary life. In the decades after World War II, military historians began documenting the various tactical and technical innovations of the war. The hedgerow cutter was recognized as a significant development, and Curtis Culin's name appeared in many accounts. However, as often happens with wartime innovations, the story became simplified and mythologized. The collaborative nature of the development was compressed into a narrative about a lone sergeant with a brilliant idea. The contributions of Dupuy, Lytton, Riley, and others were often overlooked or omitted entirely. The 48 hours fabrication time became canonical, even though the actual development took much longer. The number of units produced was inflated to 5,000, when the real figure was closer to 400. The first test tank was misidentified as a Sherman rather than a Stuart. These inaccuracies weren't malicious. They emerged from the natural process of storytelling, where complex truths get simplified for narrative clarity. But they do a disservice to the real history and to the many people who contributed to the hedgerow cutter's development. So what's the true lesson of the hedgerow cutter story? It's not about lone genius. It's about the importance of listening to ideas regardless of their source. Sergeant Culin had an observation worth developing, and Captain Dupuy was wise enough to take it seriously. It's about the necessity of technical expertise. Captain Lytton's engineering knowledge was crucial to turning a concept into a functional device. Good ideas need good execution. It's about logistics and organization. CWO Riley's ability to source materials and coordinate production was essential to scaling the solution beyond a single prototype. It's about testing and iteration. The hedgerow cutter improved continuously based on field feedback. The first design wasn't the final design, and perhaps most importantly, it's about how innovation actually happens in organizations, through collaboration, through combining different types of expertise, through being willing to try unconventional solutions to difficult problems. The hedgerow cutter succeeded not because one man was brilliant, but because a system allowed for, encouraged, and supported innovation from unexpected sources. The hedgerow cutter story remains relevant today, particularly for organizations trying to foster innovation. Modern military forces study it as a case example in the US Army's innovation doctrine. The lesson: create systems that allow good ideas to emerge from any level of the organization, provide resources for rapid prototyping and testing, and be willing to scale successful innovations quickly. Technology companies use the hedgerow cutter as a case study in user-driven innovation. The people closest to a problem often have the best insights into solutions. Create channels for those insights to reach decision makers. The story also illustrates the importance of accurate historical record keeping. The mythologized version of the hedgerow cutter story is inspiring, but the true story, messy, collaborative, iterative, is actually more valuable as a guide for how to foster real innovation. The hedgerow cutter was one of thousands of innovations, large and small, that emerged during World War II. It wasn't the most technologically sophisticated, just steel prongs welded to tanks. It didn't win the war single-handedly. The war was won by millions of people, making millions of contributions. But it mattered. It solved a specific problem at a crucial moment. It saved lives. It helped break a tactical stalemate that threatened to bog down the entire Normandy campaign. And it demonstrated something important about human ingenuity, that sometimes the best solutions to complex problems are surprisingly simple, if you can just see the problem from a different angle. Curtis Culin, James Dupuy, Stephen Lytton, Frank Riley, Harmon McNaughton, and the hundreds of welders, tankers, and engineers who built and used the hedgerow cutters all deserve credit for this achievement. They were part of a larger story of innovation under pressure, of adapting to unexpected challenges, of solving problems through collaboration and practical thinking. The hedgerow cutter's legacy isn't just the device itself, which is now a museum piece. The legacy is the lesson it teaches about how innovation really works, not through solitary genius in a sudden flash of inspiration, but through teams of people with different skills working together to turn observations into ideas, ideas into prototypes, and prototypes into effective solutions. That lesson remains as relevant today as it was in the fields of Normandy in the summer of 1944.